This is the World Workplace Europe podcast.
Welcome at the World Workplace podcast. My name is Chantal Spruit and I will be your host of today. The topic about this podcast is the regenerative movement and how it relates to facilities management. With me today is Dean Stanberry. He is the chair of IFMA, International Facility Management Association, and Wart Luscuere. He is the founder of Beyond Sustainability and he is the local lead of the Circular Economy Club. Welcome, both.
Welcome.
Hello. Thank you.
In this podcast, we will focus more on the sustainability movement and how the recent years it has been transforming into a focus more on adding value and doing more good instead of just focusing on doing things less bad. This is also referred to as regenerative movement. Thank
Easy
you.
for you to say.
And that is what we will focus on today during the podcast. And Wart, your company is called Beyond Sustainability. Could you explain what that means for you and why you've chosen that name?
Yes, so to give a little bit of background, one of the projects I was involved in in the core team from day one was the ocean cleanup. And pretty soon I understood that we investigated the problem of plastic pollutions in the oceans.
And for the listeners who are not familiar with the ocean cleanup, what is it?
It was a startup at the time and focused on marine pollution, plastic pollution. And really we were investigating the problem, like how big is the problem? And so we did expeditions and built research instruments to also look at the vertical distribution of microplastics. And pretty soon I realized, okay, it's very important to understand the scope of the problem and what we can do about that. But at the same time, we have to look at the root of the issue. Otherwise, it's just mopping with the tap running. And so that's really where, for me personally, my ambition and drive from going beyond, looking for alternatives, not limiting the negative effects, but trying to find a positive impact, positive effect. So looking at the alternatives came from. And I'm convinced there's many alternatives and options. So that's really the birthplace for me of Beyond Sustainability throughout the years.
And how would you define the regenerative movement, if you have a definition for it?
Yeah, I never put myself in that corner, but looking at it, so from Beyond Sustainability's perspective, we like to talk about resources. So we have a couple of resources that we have to manage our world with. It's energy, materials, biological and technical, topsoil, which we grow our food, air and water, and the space that we have available. And we are using them up in a dramatic way. So we have to come up with a way to not minimize the negative impact. Of course, that's an important factor, but those efficiency measures are, I'm convinced, not enough, because if we do something in a way that has a negative effect and we do it a little bit less bad, but we scale that up, then we have still an enormous negative impact. So we have a limited amount of resources that we have to utilize in a way to make the necessary transitions and to involve the whole of society in there. So in all the projects and challenges and roadmaps that we have delivered to companies and governments, then we went back to the drawing board and we redefined, because often you talk about circularity in these circumstances, but we made a definition and we said circularity has to be renewability of all these resources in the core, because if you don't have that, then we have another problem. And then we are not going far enough. And sometimes this meant making drastic measures to really get moving into another direction instead of just less bad. So that's what regenerative means for me.
Yeah.
Renewability.
And you said you started on the ocean cleanup. Before that, did you have a passion about sustainability, making the world a better place, or did that come from that first project you did?
Well, I was very much inspired by Michael Braungart, by Cradle to Cradle movement. So I met him early on. Also worked with my father, Peter Luscuere, for a long time, and he was good pals with Michael. So that was a big part of that for me. To
It
really
started
have,
early on.
yeah, to also to have the insight that a positive footprint is possible. So that whole idea of feeling negative about ourselves and trying to limit our negative impact is really limiting our thinking process of what's possible. No, we have to turn that around sometimes, step out of the out of the box and really sometimes go in another direction. And it's challenging, but it is possible to aim for a positive impact. Yeah.
All right, thank you. And Dean, how is that for you? Where did your spark around sustainability, making the world a better place, ignite?
Probably around the early 2000s when I first got involved with the U.S. Green Building Council. I've actually sat on a regional board and chaired a regional board around the Rocky Mountains in the U.S. But in the early days, of course, they came out with the first LEED rating, which was...
When you say early days, sorry to interrupt, what years are we talking about?
That's like 2000, 2001. That was, I think that was the very first LEED rating, version 1, that came out. And at that same time, there was also people that started talking about regenerative as opposed to sustainability. Now, there wasn't a lot of definition around that. The way I would explain it to people is I said, okay, if you're harvesting one tree, you need to plant two in its place. You're trying to restore the environment. A little harder to explain when you say, okay, we're extracting coal, we're extracting fossil fuels and other things like that. How do you replace those? We don't have any dinosaurs to bury to make more fossil fuel. I said, well, it is about doing less harm in some cases, but also just making sure that we're making the most of the resources that we are using. It wasn't until circular economy came along that I said, oh, okay, now here's an explanation I can wrap my head around about what it means to take a resource, make something of it, use it, and then put it back into service. Either refurbish it, reuse it in some way, but you're not wasting it by just throwing it away at the very end and putting it, it's going to show back up on my loading dock. Now, I work in real estate, commercial real estate. And what really has crystallized for me in the last few years is that commercial real estate is 37% of global carbon emissions. That's a big number, only eclipsed by transportation. And out of that, probably 85%. Is in building operations, not in its construction, but in its operation. And that's where IFMA lives, facility management and operations. So I said, we have a huge opportunity and responsibility to reduce that carbon impact. And so more and more what I hear, in my mind anyway, the word sustainability has been somewhat replaced with decarbonization. Because all of a sudden people are now more aware of the fact of, well, we have to reduce that overall carbon emissions. And so decarbonization seems to be, where everybody is now resonating to. It means the same thing, but has a slightly different set of priorities.
All right, so, and one of my follow-up questions, so I'm glad you already addressed that, is how have you seen the sustainability movement change over the years? And actually what you're saying is it's become more concrete with terms of circularity, so we know what we're working towards, and at the same time it's started focusing more on CO2 reductions. Is that correct?
Yes. So, sustainability has been around for many, many centuries, actually. You can trace efforts back to the 1700s of people working to regenerate natural spaces and things like that. For me, it really took off in the first Earth Day in 1970, April 22nd, coming right up. 1970, it was the most widely publicized event that was focused on, what was essentially trying to warn people about the impending climate crisis. Of course, very few people really took it seriously at the time. But now we have, hundreds of millions of people celebrated every year, and 190 countries participate. So we get a lot of press, but it's only been in the last, maybe decade, where we've seen greater effects of climate change, actually attributing directly to climate change, and more people being impacted, where now all of a sudden it's no longer a debate about if there is whether you believe the science or not. You can't ignore the damage and the destruction that's being caused by hurricanes and floods and all these other things. So all of a sudden now I think there is a greater recognition that we must do something if we're going to preserve, the planet for our next generations, because there is no planet B.
I think that
Yeah.
there's a multitude of problems that we're facing, but of course the big one is climate change. And I think the interesting part of sustainability is a very multi-interpretable word. If you ask 10 specialists, you get 10 different. So I try to avoid it. So I have it
It's also a
in the name
buzzword
of the company,
nowadays.
but at the same time, I'm trying to stay away from it. So again, what I said earlier, efficiency is not always. It's important, but it's not always saving grace. Sometimes you want to look at effective solutions. So to understand. So as a small example, a few years ago we went to the island of Samsø in Denmark to learn from them, basically to look at what they're doing. And 15 years ago, it was an island with farmers, fishermen, who were very heavily fossil fuel dependent. Import prices went up. The farmers, the price of milk was going down. The farmers didn't know how to keep their business afloat. And the suggestion was made: maybe we need to have an energy transition here. And initially, you can visualize it. The stoic Danish farmer wasn't really embracing it from day one. But what they did is they invited everybody in this Viking circle with a talking stick, and they invited everyone to talk about it. And they soon realized, if we are doing this together, if we do it in an inclusive way, if we invite everybody on the island to be part of this transition and really include them also from a financial perspective, that they really own this themselves, then that was the key to make it happen. So the technology was not the limiting factor, the funds were not, it was the inclusive approach. And I call this inclusive productivity, where you include these people into this to make them relatively self-sufficient. And now, in the meantime, it is an renewable energy exporting island, where these farmers have embraced it completely, because they now not only depend on the milk they're selling, but they have 2 or 3 additional business cases. And this combination really made it happen. And maybe it's not always the highest technical approach, but it's an effective way locally to make it more resilient and self-sufficient, to be less reliant on imports. And I think that can be a driver, and you can scale that also for Europe-wise. We need to understand historically drivers were scarcity, were wars, were literal or philosophical individuals that we looked up to. But now it's more about how do we provide for our family, friends, how are we more self-sufficient, how do we lower cost of living, and how do we pursue well-being and be a steward for this planet, of course, of which we only have one to, we have no backup.
Yeah, I always think that sustainability is more of a social challenge. Yeah, I always think that sustainability is more of a social challenge rather than a technological challenge. Technologically, we can do a lot, make things very efficiently, but then we're still focusing on doing things less bad rather than really adding value. And I think it's really that social component that we're often missing.
There was a good Harvard Business Review article last year, I think, on why is it so hard for people to wrap their head around sustainability? And they said it's really it's a function of the mind. That for most people, you have your day-to-day problems, your job, your family, you're dealing with things, and so the issue of climate change and all of the impacts isn't really affecting you. Some people it is, but for the vast majority of the people on the planet, it's not on a daily basis. So it gets shoved to the back of your mind, and it's not a priority. And they said that's just a sort of a general thing about humans. And the next event is starting very soon. We'll get another gong here in a moment. But I thought that was just an interesting observation about why the general population is not more concerned about it on a day-to-day basis. They'll show up for Earth Day, and then the other 364 days of the year they're doing something else.
Yeah, I think it's a very complex issue, and it's hard to really make that personal and to make it a personal driver and personal motivation.
At the same time, I also think that really good solutions are not ones that either ask too much on the short term of people to change, because change is always difficult, and it should not limit our expected quality of life. So we really don't like moving back to, because oftentimes also the word sustainability or regenerative movement can be associated with the wool socks movement, or however you would call it. And I think that's really unfair. I think that's why I also try to stay away from these words sometimes, because it's really about why are we not allowing us to have a better alternative. So then again, I come back to this positive footprint. Why do we allow this amount of fossil fuels or fossil fuel derivative products to have all these externalized costs, and which is the reason why many alternatives cannot really easily compete with it. But if you look at it, a good friend of mine, he is Bob Hendricks. He's growing coffins from mycelium. I don't think it was his initial goal to do that, but he studied the characteristics of mycelium, which is the root layer of fungi. And he realized that if you mix in certain other materials, you can make a solid building block from it. And he applied that in another way, which is actually enriching the ground and metabolizing all kinds of nasty chemicals that end up in the ground. So it's a whole different way of looking at it. You can look at plastic alternatives for plastic coffee cups, where you don't need that small. You don't need to reduce and make it a ever smaller plastic layer within this cup. You can look at coatings from
Told you it was coming.
You can look at coatings that you can derive from algae, and you can put them into onto a bio-based, biodegradable material, and you have a good alternative for a cup or for a plate to serve a hamburger on.
Yeah.
So there's really nice alternatives, and we need to get away from these unfair comparisons. They have to stand on their own. We should not limit ourselves on the quality level. We should just create a fair playing field and include the externalized costs from fossil products.
Yeah, and I think that example really shows well what we mean by the regenerative movement, or however you want to call it. Like, not focusing on trying to reduce the amount of plastic every single time by a smidgen, but really focus on an alternative. And Dean, I'm wondering, how do you see that in the facility management industry? Do you see a lot of these innovations happening, change of process, change of thinking, or do you think we're falling behind a little?
Well, we're definitely behind. There's some reasons for that. just on that point, though, and the saying that I use with people is don't sacrifice good chasing great. Sometimes a solution is good enough, and you don't need to go further than that.
Could you give an example of what you mean by that?
Well, there's a lot of people that say we need to stop all fossil fuel production today. Well, that's not practical and it's not possible. There's things we can do, but I think we need to, take a practical look at it. It's like, yes, it's taken a couple of 100 years to dig ourselves into this hole. We're not going to dig out in a month, right? It's going to take a while. So, what can we do? And some of it is, up to individuals. If we continue dependence on fossil fuel, it's because we continue to buy the products. We continue to create the demand. And I because I give climate change presentations too, and to explain to people why is this a problem. And I said, but you need to also be part of the solution. I don't just talk to facility managers about being efficient in their buildings. I try to live it. My house is very efficient. I have solar on my roof. I drive an electric car. So I try to do what I can. Now, am I perfect? Is my wife and I perfect? No, we're not. She could probably take, less of a shower than she does and use less water, but I'm not going to go there because I want to stay married.
That makes sense. And I think also what I'm getting after is, and I think driving electric cars is a really interesting example, because often, and no offense to you or anyone that drives an electric car, it's better than driving a diesel car, but I think when you talk about regenerative movement, what you would want to create is an alternative for the car. Because everyone having an individual car with the batteries and how they're extracted is not sustainable in the long run. So how can we create that in the facilities management environment?
Yeah, I like to hook on to that, to your story just now. I think the connection there to the facilities management and the workplaces, I more and more realize today, speaking to a lot of the people and companies here, is that something I've pursuing already for many years. So every time we have the ask to in a circular and sustainable way renovate a building, for example, and come up with ideas and suggestions, we try to challenge them really to go the extra step. But always in mind with not only how is this building going to be used today and tomorrow, but also in the next cycle of usage. So what technologies really computed to that? And I think one of the core, one of the most important ones, if we're looking at the bigger energy transition, it's not the question where do we get our energy from in the future. There's an immense amount of renewable energy available in the sun and in the wind and in the oceans. It's about how we extract them. And there is the limiting factor. It's in the materials that we have available to make that energy transition happen. Now apply that into the built environment and into the facility management surrounding. I think there's a big ask to all the companies here to prepare to facilitate the upcoming materials passports, because the buildings of tomorrow and the systems and all the from small scale to big scale, from long term to short term, here's where the demand is, because the business of tomorrow have to take ownership of their materials. And therefore I'm optimistic, because if you own the materials that you are dependent on to have your business case of tomorrow, so if you're selling cars today, you also want to be able to sell them tomorrow. You're committing yourself to these materials, and therein lies the need to make them really circular, really renewable, because your business depends on it. So taking ownership of that material, locking that into materials passports, it has to be managed, and it's not just about what is in it exactly, but more importantly, when does it become available, in what quality, in what quantity. and then you know what you can do with it.
So let me hit that with the built environment. So the notion of circular economy is we're fundamentally changing the economics of how we work, how we live, how we build the world, going from linear to circular economy. That means that there's a lot of things about economics that change. What are the economics of buildings? Today, developers find an opportunity to build something, they put together their business case, they build it, they almost immediately sell it. So they're not holding on to that. Somebody else is buying it. Mm-hmm. And in fact, most buildings, look at the building we're in right now. I don't know when this was built, but I'm guessing it wasn't yesterday.
I think quite a long time ago.
Quite a long time ago. How long has this building been here, and how many different purposes has it had over its life? How efficient is its operation today compared to when it was originally built? So we look at those things. Today, the real estate investment companies or organizations haven't really been concerned with the operation of a building. They've only been concerned with buying it, putting no money into it while they hold it, and then selling it for a profit. Now, that's an oversimplification, but
so I guess what you're saying is that we need to change that process as well.
Well, what is changing in that process is that the more we talk about the need for net zero buildings, the investment community is now starting to ask questions like, can you show me how efficient you've created this building? Because if you can't give me the digital assets along with the physical asset, I'm not going to buy it. So we're seeing a shift in that industry. And so that's where I think this is really going to go, is it's going to create the demand for more efficient net zero and new construction as well. And I know we're getting close to end.
Yes,
but
we're getting a sign that we're almost out of time.
Yeah,
you wanted to add something?
Just to up the ante a little bit, because I think this is an important opportunity. Everything, I agree with everything, but the missing, the real opportunity here is not to just go for net zero or whatever goal is set by whatever boardroom. It's really to look at the opportunity, the potential, not just of the building, but with its surroundings, and identifying what you can call the co-benefits, because there you really put yourself on another level, and you become it's not a one-dimensional way of trying to solve a problem. It's by inviting your neighbors in and looking outside and connecting through technology, but also through social networks, and really have this positive effect, positive impact in your surrounding neighborhood. And by the way, also on the monetary side, for example, you can alleviate net congestion, you can have better mobility. So you have all these positive effects, which can all be monetizable, but you have to have the different mindset to look further than the front door, connect to the surroundings, search for these co-benefits, and increase the value also.
I agree, and but I also see that is sort of a next stage of development. If we can get owners to agree to start doing net zero buildings, then we might be able to build that community aspect of saying, now let's look at what we can do together instead of individually. We're still very driven by individual profit motive in that particular space.
Yeah, I also think it depends on where you are at,
yes.
The cultural location, the person you are, maybe the persons you're working with. And I think that's also what we were trying to do with this podcast, sort of change the narrative of what is sustainability. Maybe net zero is sustainability. I don't think we give a definition of that today. I'm not going to define that either. But I think how can we move beyond that? And I think we touched upon some nice topics. Unfortunately, we are out of time, so we're going to have to cut it off here. I hope we were able to inspire you a little bit about how you can include regeneration into the facilities management industry. That was it for today's podcast live from the World Workplace Europe. Thank you for listening or watching.
This is the World Workplace Europe podcast.